The businessman judged by appearance, and what he learned was unforgettable. The sun sank low over Dallas Love Field Airport, casting the tarmac in golden and amber hues. Business travelers moved through the busy terminal, some with their phones in hand, others pulling rolling bags that clattered over the tiles. Among them was Peter Hensley, a man who had built his life around calculated success. Standing tall in a custom navy suit, the sharp crease in his trousers reflected the precision he demanded in everything he did. Peter glanced at his first-class ticket and smirked slightly. To him, first class wasn't just a convenience, it was a statement about his position in the world. He confidently made his way toward Gate 14, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. A flight to Los Angeles was just another part of his busy schedule, another step in his endless pursuit of success. As the flight attendants called for first-class boarding, Peter stepped forward with an air of entitlement. He quickly scanned the other passengers in line, assessing their worth or lack of it. He particularly noticed one man behind him. The man was about Peter's height but stockier, exuding a calm confidence that felt out of place. His outfit was notably simple: black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, which Peter thought was far too casual for first class. Must have won a ticket in a raffle, he muttered to himself with a smirk. Peter boarded the plane and found his seat by the window. Settling in, he relaxed into the comfort of first class and watched as the other passengers boarded. To his surprise, the casually dressed man stopped at his row, checked the seat number, and stowed his carry-on in the overhead bin. Peter froze as the man sat down beside him in the aisle seat. For a moment, neither said a word. Peter's jaw tightened, resisting the urge to say something, and instead pulled out his tablet, tapping away at emails. But he couldn't stop glancing at his new seatmate, who seemed completely unaffected. The man adjusted his seatbelt and pulled out a book. Peter squinted at the book's title, noticing it wasn't a bestseller and appeared more intellectual than light reading. Of course, Peter thought to himself, trying to look smart. As the flight attendants made their rounds, offering pre-departure drinks, they reached Peter's row. The attendant addressed the man first with a warm smile. "Good evening, Mr. Greer. Can I get you something to drink before we take off?" Peter blinked, surprised by the familiarity in her tone. Mr. Greer politely declined, flashing a smooth, easy smile. Peter noticed the man's name embroidered on the book cover, Greer, and his mind started turning. Still, he shrugged it off, dismissing it as unimportant. But there was something about the man that bothered Peter. Little did he know, this flight would turn out to be anything but ordinary, and Peter's assumptions would lead him to face a truth he never saw coming. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Peter's frustration grew. The man, Mr. Greer, remained completely at ease, absorbed in his book, occasionally making notes in the margins. Meanwhile, Peter's tablet glowed with an overwhelming flood of emails, his wall of self-importance. The silence between them felt heavy, at least from Peter's point of view. Annoyed, Peter cleared his throat loudly, hoping to get the man's attention, but Mr. Greer didn't so much as glance up. Frustrated, Peter decided to break the silence with a comment, though his tone was laced with condescension. "Looks like you got lucky with this seat," Peter said, his voice dripping with false politeness. Mr. Greer looked up, offering a neutral but polite smile. "Excuse me," he replied. "I mean, first class isn't usually this casual," Peter added. Peter said, subtly gesturing toward the man's hoodie. "But hey, I guess everyone deserves to treat themselves once in a while." The comment hung in the air, laden with implication. A few passengers sitting across the aisle glanced over, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Mr. Greer slowly closed his book, his movements deliberate. "That's one way to see it," he said evenly, his calm tone carrying an unspoken weight, as if he were deciding whether this conversation was worth continuing. Peter, emboldened by what he saw as a lack of resistance, chuckled. "Don't get me wrong. I'm all for people experiencing a bit of luxury. It's just that not everyone is used to it. You know, it makes things feel different." He gave a knowing smile, as though he were sharing a secret with someone who couldn't possibly understand. Mr. Greer's response was unexpected. "Different isn't always a bad thing," he said. Peter leaned back slightly, caught off guard by the reply. But before he could respond, the flight attendant returned with drinks for their row, She handed Peter his sparkling water and then turned to Mr. Greer. "Mr. Greer, are you sure I can't get you anything?" "It's no trouble at all," she said, her tone deferential, almost reverent. Peter frowned, confused. Why was she so attentive to this man? He glanced around, noticing other flight attendants stealing quick looks at Mr. Greer as they moved through the cabin. Tension built in Peter's chest, but his ego demanded he maintain control. "Well," Peter said with a forced grin, "I guess you're a regular then." The sarcasm was barely hidden. Mr. Greer didn't take the bait. "You could say that," he replied, his voice measured. The flight attendant's next words shattered Peter's fragile facade. "Mr. Greer, if there's anything you need during the flight, just let me or any of the crew know. We're happy to accommodate." Her smile lingered before she walked away, leaving Peter stunned, his curiosity giving way to unease. Who exactly was this man? But Peter wasn't ready to back down yet. His pride wouldn't let him, even as cracks started to form in his assumptions. The flight leveled out at cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers settled into their routines, some scrolling through their phones, others enjoying in-flight meals. Yet for Peter, the world seemed to narrow down to the man sitting beside him, Mr. Greer. Peter's mind raced. He wanted to dismiss the man as an anomaly, someone who had somehow ended up in first class by luck or as a favor. But the flight attendant's deference, the man's quiet confidence, and even the way other passengers subtly looked at him suggested otherwise. Determined to regain his perceived superiority, Peter leaned over, flashing his signature business smile, the one that masked his disdain beneath a thin layer of charm. "So what do you do?" he asked. Mr. Greer didn't immediately look up. He finished writing something in the margin of his book, then carefully closed it and placed it on the tray table. Meeting Peter's gaze with an unreadable expression, he replied, "I work in management." "Management?" Peter echoed, tightening his smile. It was a vague answer, and he knew it. "That's great. Lots of opportunity in that field. Small business, I assume?" Mr. Greer tilted his head slightly, as though weighing Peter's question. "Something like that," he said, his tone polite but noncommittal. Peter chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, good for you. It's nice to see someone breaking barriers," he said, leaning back, satisfied with his thinly veiled compliment. But Mr. Greer didn't react as expected. Instead of gratitude, he simply regarded Peter for a moment, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Breaking barriers?" Mr. Greer repeated, his voice steady. Interesting choice of words. Peter felt a flicker of irritation. The man wasn't taking the bait, wasn't following the narrative Peter had built in his mind. It made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. Trying to distract himself, Peter turned to his tablet, scrolling through financial reports, but his focus was gone. Every now and then, his eyes would dart to the book on Mr. Greer's tray table. The name A. Greer stood out, as if challenging him to ignore it. The pages of the book were filled with notes and highlights, the kind of meticulous attention Peter associated with someone experienced in leadership. It gnawed at him, this puzzle he couldn't solve. Who was this man, and why did it feel like the balance of power between them had shifted, despite Peter's efforts to maintain control? The tipping point came when another flight attendant approached their row. She wasn't carrying drinks or snacks. Instead, she had a handwritten note on airline stationery. She handed it to Mr. Greer with a warm smile. "Compliments of the captain," she said before disappearing down the aisle. Peter couldn't hide his curiosity any longer. "Friend of the captain, huh?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Greer glanced at the note, his expression neutral. "You could say that," he replied. Then he folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his pocket without saying another word. Peter clenched his jaw, frustration growing. This man, this enigma, wasn't just sitting in first class. He was commanding the space in a way Peter couldn't, and it was driving him mad. But Peter had no idea that the answer to his questions was closer and more shocking than he could have imagined. The hum of the cabin filled the silence as Peter's mind raced, working overtime. The man beside him remained calm, flipping through his book with a composure Peter could only pretend to have. Peter's frustration simmered beneath the surface, his mind fixating on the same question. Who is this guy? It wasn't long before the answer revealed itself. About halfway through the flight, The head flight attendant approached their row. She carried herself with the poise of someone with years of experience, but now wore an expression that was a mix of nervousness and excitement. Stopping just short of Mr. Greer, she smiled broadly. "Mr. Greer," she said with a slight bow of her head, "the captain asked me to personally greet you and thank you for flying with us today." Peter's eyebrows shot up. Why was the captain thanking this man? "Thank you," Mr. Greer responded politely, his tone as steady as ever. "I appreciate the hospitality." The flight attendant paused for a moment, her eyes flicking toward Peter briefly before returning to Mr. Greer. "If there's anything we can do to make your flight more pleasant, please feel free to ask." Peter couldn't hold back any longer. "Excuse me," he cut it in, his voice sharp enough to draw attention. "Am I missing something here? Who exactly is this gentleman?" The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at Mr. Greer, who gave a small nod, signaling for her to speak. She smiled stiffly and explained, "Mr. Greer is the CEO of Greer Holdings. He's also one of the airline's major shareholders." The words hit Peter like a punch in the gut. His mouth opened slightly, but he was speechless. He stared at the man next to him, who had casually returned to his book, acting as if the announcement was insignificant. For a moment, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to close in on Peter. The tension he had been holding turned into a sickening knot in his stomach. He replayed every dismissive comment, every condescending smile, feeling them rebound back at him with crushing force. Now, the other passengers were watching, their curiosity turning into quiet satisfaction. The man who had been so confident and quick to judge was now visibly shrinking in his seat. Peter could feel their eyes on him, pricking at his already wounded pride like tiny needles. "You've got to be kidding me," Peter muttered, unsure if he was talking to the flight attendant, Mr. Greer, or himself. Finally, Mr. Greer looked up, his calm gaze meeting Peter's. "Not exactly the raffle winner you thought I was, huh?" His tone wasn't angry, but there was a sharpness to it, a quiet reminder of their earlier exchange. Peter's face flushed, the heat of humiliation creeping up his neck. "I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, but the words felt hollow, even to himself. "Didn't you?" Mr. Greer asked, his voice soft and measured. Then he went back to his book, leaving Peter to deal with the weight of his own assumptions. But the worst was still ahead. Peter was about to learn that actions had consequences, and sometimes lessons came with an audience. The cabin seemed quieter now, but Peter was sure that was just his embarrassment amplifying every sound that wasn't his. The nearby passengers tried not to stare, but their furtive glances made it clear they were relishing this moment of poetic justice. Peter's chest tightened as he stared at his tablet, pretending to focus on emails that now seemed trivial. Mr. Greer, on the other hand, exuded an effortless calm, continuing to read his book as if nothing had happened. Occasionally, he would underline a passage or jot something down. This infuriated Peter even more, not because Mr. Greer had done anything wrong, but because he hadn't done anything wrong. Every judgment Peter had made, every sarcastic comment now felt like a spotlight highlighting his own insecurities. The flight attendants kept up their service, but Peter noticed how they lingered a little longer near Mr. Greer, offering refills and snacks. One even brought him a handwritten note, which he accepted with a gracious nod. Peter couldn't help but notice the difference in how they treated him compared to how they treated Mr. Greer. With him, they were polite but distant. With Mr. Greer, their demeanor was much warmer. It wasn't just the crew. Passenger body language had shifted too. A woman across the aisle, who had seemed uncomfortable during Peter's earlier remarks, now gave Mr. Greer a friendly smile when their eyes met. A man a few rows behind leaned forward and whispered to his seatmate, subtly gesturing toward Mr. Greer. Peter's chest tightened as he realized he had gone from being invisible to being silently, but unmistakably judged. Unable to sit in the silence any longer, he turned to Mr. Greer. "Look," he began, his voice quiet. "I think we got off on the wrong foot." Mr. Greer put his book down and looked at Peter, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Do we need to talk about this?" he asked, his tone calm. Peter hesitated, unsure of how to express himself without seeming like he was trying to salvage his pride. I didn't realize who you were," he admitted, his voice shaky. "And if you had?" Mr. Greer asked, raising an eyebrow. Peter opened his mouth, but then closed it again. The truth was too uncomfortable to say out loud. If he had known who Mr. Greer was, he would have treated him differently. That realization weighed heavily on him, a painful reminder of the biases he had carried into the flight. I guess I made some assumptions, Peter finally said, after a long pause. Mr. Greer leaned back, observing Peter for a moment before speaking. Assumptions are easy, he said. They let you stay comfortable with the story you've already decided to tell yourself. But they're not the truth. Peter nodded slowly, the words stinging. It wasn't an angry rebuke. It was worse. It was a quiet truth that left no room for debate. The rest of the flight passed in near silence. Peter occasionally glanced at Mr. Greer, who had gone back to his book, but Peter didn't dare interrupt again. Instead, he found himself thinking about the lesson he had just learned. It wasn't just about Mr. Greer. It was about how Peter saw the world, the assumptions he made unknowingly, and the quiet harm those assumptions caused. As the plane descended into Los Angeles, Peter felt both relief and regret. Relief that the flight was ending and regret that he hadn't handled himself better. As the passengers disembarked, Peter stayed behind, letting them go first. He watched as Mr. Greer exited, greeted warmly by an airline representative at the gate. Peter sighed as he grabbed his bag from the overhead bin. He wasn't proud of his behavior, but maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones you expect. They're the ones that make you confront your own flaws. As Peter entered the busy terminal at LAX, he felt different. The world around him continued as usual, passengers rushing to connections, announcements echoing over the intercom, staff moving through the crowds. But Peter's mind was occupied with thoughts of the quiet man from the flight. Mr. Greer had taught him something without raising his voice or giving a lecture. It was in the way he carried himself, in how he refused to stoop to Peter's level of judgment. It was a lesson Peter would not forget. Your assumptions say more about you than the people you judge. Peter found himself questioning not just his behavior, but why he had been so quick to form those opinions in the first place. Maybe it was time to challenge those ingrained habits and approach people with curiosity instead of judgment. He had a long way to go, but the first step was acknowledging that there was work to be done. As he made his way to baggage claim, Peter glanced back at the gate, half expecting to see Mr. Greer, but of course he was already gone, leaving only the lingering impact of his presence. And here's the real takeaway. It's easy to judge someone based on first impressions, but everyone you meet has a story, a depth you might not immediately see. Assumptions are shortcuts, lazy ways to understand the world. Instead, take the time to ask questions, look deeper, and treat everyone with the respect they deserve. You might be surprised by what you learn, not just about others, but about yourself.